Okay, good morning, everyone. Thanks for dialing into another Tuesday frequency. And the topic today is Helix 5, and I see we have a couple of people interested enough to dial in at this early hour. And I actually have been planning for this to go a bit different. In particular, to have one of my one of my partners from the engineering team join us. And this didn't happen so far. He might join us later, but I think in the meantime we can get started. And given the small group, I would think we treat this as simple and conversational as possible, and then make the best out of it. So, as you are probably aware, we've been, or the product that you know as Edge Delivery Services and Adobe Experience Manager sites as a cloud service with document-based authoring, and Adobe Experience Manager sites as a cloud service-based authoring, has a history, and that history started with a project code named Helix, and we've undergone a couple of architectural revisions in that project over the past 5 years, and actually we think it's a really important point for the health of the product to be able to do these architectural revisions, right? To keep in line with the growing demands of the product, and of course to keep the product itself maintainable and easy to operate for the engineering team. And one aspect of this is that it's a really, really small team that is responsible for the day-to-day operations, and the day-to-day operations is basically done by the same people who are building it, and that means every one of us is on call at least once or twice a week. I'm on call right now, so let's hope nothing is going wrong, and typically nothing is going wrong. So I only mention being on call when I want to talk about our engineering process. To be fair, and in the past year, right, since we launched the product as Edge Delivery Services last year, and announced it under a different name at Summit last year, we've seen tremendous growth in usage, but this also clarified a couple of things about things that are not being used very actively, and things that we need to harden. And a particular area that we saw as a concern was our CDN configuration, and as a concern not in the sense of this is causing us problems now, but as a concern in the sense of this might cause us problems down the road. Hi. And
Hey.
and that's why about August last year we decided, well, guys, it has been a fun run with the Helix 4 architecture, and the Helix 4 architecture was basically the most important thing in the Helix 4 architecture was the introduction of Cloudflare as a second architectural tier. It has been a fun run with the Helix 4 architecture. It's time for an architectural revision, and the biggest change in that architectural revision is on our Fastly stack. And to give a bit of background there, and some of this architecture are things that you can see very clearly when you're using the product, right? It's exposed concrete, and probably the biggest one is that there's a difference between hlx.page and hlx.live, right? hlx.page is what your authors are using to preview the content, and you basically have the ability to see content that has not been published yet. And on hlx.live, you only see the published content. And the way this worked the way this works at the moment in Helix 4 is that Helix Live is a CDN service that is sitting in front of Helix.page. So Helix.live is essentially providing a caching layer to Helix.page, and it's telling Helix.page, you know what, deliver slightly different content for me. In particular content that has been previewed, not just in particular content that has been published, not just content that has been previewed. And one of the side effects of this is that on the one hand, we now have to deal with two quite different CDN configurations, right? Helix.page is doing a lot of things because it essentially has to handle every single possible request type, whether we are talking about media requests, or we are talking about code, or we are talking about content requests that are going through the pipeline, and that's leading to a lot of VCL code in one single place. And on the other hand, hlx.live, I'm not going to say a dump service, but a service with much lower complexity, but that was quite disparate from the hlx.page service. And when you have a lot of complexity in one single place, this is what I think a fair way to describe it is to call it technical debt, right? Because that's the kind of code where you get scared changing it, and being scared of changing code is something that you never want to be, in particular in an area where you know that you have to change code, and where you know that you have to make changes, and that's why one of the big drivers for the Helix 5 architecture was basically to recompose how we do our CDN. And the way it's being recomposed is, so the first, and with this we can talk about the first customer visible change. And the first customer visible change is, given that we are going to change the CDN configuration anyway, and given that we want to operate the new architecture and the old architecture in parallel for as long as we need to, we needed a new set of host names. And what a better time to just say goodbye to our beloved HLX and go to aem.page and aem.live. So aem.page and aem.live are your equivalents of helix.page and helix.live, and they're running on, ironically, the Helix 5 architecture. And you know how naming goes. I think we have to stay with the Helix name for the next architectural revision, and then we've overtaken AEM and we can simply call it AEM7. But never quote me on that. So so the first change that you as a user are going to see is that it's now aem.page and aem.live. The next change for us is that aem.page and aem.live are now the same CDN service. And this means this brings a couple of interesting advantages. The most interesting advantage for you as a user is that we now have caching on aem.page. And caching on aem.page means the authoring experience is going to be a bit faster, and that's always a good thing. And it's also a good thing for us because it means less load on the backend, right? And one of the interesting things, because we are now sharing the same CDN service between aem.page and aem.live, is that we also have greater cache efficiency between the two, right? Especially for things that are essentially the same, like for instance all media that we're delivering, which is immutable, and also all code, right, which is tied to the branch and not to the not to the preview published state. And then the next thing is entirely an internal one, which is that for essentially every single of these services that are handling a particular request flow, we now have a dedicated service. So for instance, there's now a media.aem, a media.aem.live service, and a code.aem.live service, and a content.aem.live service, and so on. And each of these services is way simpler than helix.page ever has been, because it can take care of only one particular task. And this also allowed us to introduce a couple of new pieces that haven't been integrated into the stack in that way before. One, let me talk about the less important one first, because it's a bit closer to my heart, which is for a very long time, if you've been snooping around in Chrome's network inspector, and you've had a lucky day, you might have seen requests going to rum.hlx.page. And this is our rum collection endpoint. And I'm saying you have to be lucky because we are only sending it on every 100th request. So unless you're in the business of debugging rum, which you shouldn't be, that should be my business, you wouldn't see this, right? Of course, unless you're the 100th visitor. If you're the 1000th visitor, you get a free iPad. So this service has been causing cause issues for some of our not cause CRS issues. Basically, some of our customers have been locking down cross-site requests for their domains and inadvertently turned off rum. And for this reason, the rum.aem.page service is now a proper backend service that can be accessed on your domain /rum, and that's basically making these rum requests the first party requests. It's adding a bit more robustness in the light of headers and CDN configuration, and is again generally a largely invisible change, but leading to greater accuracy. The second part is that we are introducing a service that is config.aem.page, and this config.aem.page is again it's one of the core changes that we are introducing with Helix.5, and we basically call it the config service. And the config service has a couple of moving parts to it. There's on the one hand the config.aem.page, which is essentially just a simple CDN service. Then there's a config lambda function, and this config lambda function is reading configuration files, which are essentially JSON documents, from a config bus, which is essentially just an S3 bucket. And again, we are going to have, or we have equivalents for all of this in Cloudflare, where it's not S3 but R2. So you know the drill. But with the config service, we now have the ability to access configuration for a particular site, not just in the pipeline, which we had before, but also at the CDN level. And what are these configurations, right? And the most common configuration that you have already been that you've already experienced is the configuration of headers, right? So whenever you put a header configuration into the spreadsheet, what happened was in Helix 4, this configuration was read as part of the pipeline rendering, which meant that we could apply these headers to all resources that were going through the pipeline service, but we couldn't apply it to any of the service. We couldn't apply it to any of the resources that were not going through the pipeline, right? And that meant, for instance, if you wanted to apply headers, for instance, to your media resources where, give me 1 second. Media resources where okay, there's Toby asking, hey, where are we meeting? So media resources were basically bypassing the pipeline, and they couldn't get any headers, and that meant in some cases customers were in some, give me 1 second. Okay. In some cases, customers were complaining, right? I'm applying this particular header, and now my security team or my SEO team is asking, why are they not coming through? We would say, have you seen our media URLs? They are incredibly hard to guess, unless you already have the image, in which case they're incredibly easy to guess because you just need to fetch the file. And this is being addressed through the config bus. There's another thing that we can do with the config bus is we can put one configuration in there. Well, and before I get to this, one of the features that many of you haven't been one of the things that many of you haven't been using so far, but that we have been rolling out to a couple of our customers who had an incredible amount of sites running on Edge delivery services, is the ability to have configuration inheritance. Right, so you basically had the ability to say this site is inheriting a configuration from another site, and through that configuration inheritance, you could administer certain things much easier. Right, you could apply metadata. You could apply metadata in a more scalable way, and that was generally a good thing for this small number of customers with a large number of sites. But as I mentioned, right, it was essentially tied to the pipeline, and it and the way it was built was mainly more or less ad hoc, right? We said maybe this could be a good thing. Let's see how applicable it is. So with the new config service, we have a way more robust configuration inheritance system, because we can simply look at the org configuration, we can look at the site configuration, merge them according to override rules, which is the site is overriding the org, and we are good to go. And the next thing that this config service allows us to do, it allows us to do a setting that, or it allows us to do something through configuration that in the past we did through convention. And what we did in the past through convention was defining where the code for a particular site is residing. Right. So in the past, if you went to, let's say, main Helix website Adobe, we would know, well, this is the code for this is coming out of the config bus, is coming out of the code bus in the Adobe org, in the Helix website repository in the main branch. And now with the config bus, you can point essentially to a repository for your site without having to clone a repository for your site. And internally, we've been calling this repoless sites. And as always, when you hear when you hear somebody in technology calling some things and then they're less, that's a bit of a lie, right? Serverless still has servers, repoless still has repos. It's just that you don't have to care about the repos anymore, right? Just as we don't have to care about the servers anymore. And that is going to be really fantastic for customers that are running these site factories, right, where they have a lot of sites running off the same template, because they can make a change to one single repository and bang, 100, 200 sites are updated in one go, without a lot of fuss. And thanks to the config bus, you could even say that you have things where you say parts of the site functionality are essentially decided through configuration, right? So you could say we are taking colors and we are taking fonts and we are taking, let's say, the title tag out of the configuration, and that means the code that you're writing in your repositories can go even farther than that, right? So fantastic for scenarios where you either have multi-language sites, where you have geo sites, where you have, let's say, local dealerships, and so on. So a great way of handling a lot of content at once. And this is the config bus. It's fairly deep in the bowels of the new architecture, but I think it's one of the things that is going to enable a couple of really fun and interesting use cases. A couple of really fun and interesting use cases. So I'm really looking forward to seeing you using this new config service and this new config bus. And I see that Toby is joining us, and actually I have to take the blame for this, because I got Toby to agree to join us, and then I didn't send him a calendar invite. So he completely missed it, and that's why Dominic and I typically team up. So sorry, Toby, for the last minute notice. I'm still in the process of going through the architecture and explaining the rationale. I've already explained the switch to aem.page and aem.live. I've explained the introduction of the new config service. I've explained how we are serving .rum from the same CDN, and I think the last point that I want to, or the last change that we are including in Helix 5, and we are getting even more esoteric now with this, is mutual TLS authentication for your CDN to aem.live and aem.page. The background for this is following. If you are running an authenticated site, right, either because you don't want either because you want your previews to be entirely private, which means every user has to log in to preview something, or because you are implementing things like closed user groups and access control. What you would have to do in the past, you would basically enable authentication on your helix.live site, and you would then reach out to us, in particular to Toby, and Toby would generate a JWT token for you, which you could stick into your CDN. This JWT token would basically allow your CDN to pretend that it is a logged-in user, and as a logged-in user, it could see the entire content and could serve the content. And this was practical and cool for the simple reason as that it enabled you to have authenticated content, right? And it was impractical and uncool for the simple reason that Toby had to generate JWT tokens that we had to pass them around. And most importantly, we gave these JWT tokens for security reasons a 1 hour expiry, not a 1 hour, a 1 year expiry, which means this is essentially a never-ending task, right? We have to remember that we need to rotate these tokens. Nobody wants to think of that, and on top of that, the power of a JWT token-based authentication is only as strong as the token is long, right? So we thought, is there a way to get this to a higher level of security? And generally, if you want to get something to a higher level of security, you need to push it down the stack. And that's what we are doing here with MTLS. And MTLS stands for Mutual Transport Layer Security. Typically, not normal people call it client certificates. And the way it works in a normal setup is that that you have a party that accepts the client certificate, right? Which could be, for instance, your corporate network. And this corporate network issues a certificate and hands it out to you as the client. And for most of us, this is happening through things like corporate device management, right? Which means these client certificates get automatically installed on your devices, and they do things like, for instance, and now when your browser is visiting a page that requires a client certificate, the page, as part of the TLS handshake, is basically going to say, and by the way, I want to see your client certificate, right? So your browser is going to pick the client certificate that it has, and if it has multiple certificates that apply to this site, you get an ugly pop-up, an ugly and confusing pop-up that is asking you which certificate to present. And just as your client is validating the certificate that the server is presenting, the server will be validating the certificate that the client is presenting. And if both sides thinks that the other side is legit, then only the HTTP connection is established, and all is fine. And client certificates are also sometimes used for service-to-service authentication. Right, and it's typically following a similar pattern, which means that the server is essentially operating a private certificate agency. So it's the server that is handing out certificates, and the client administrator, which is in this case another service, would need to install these. And you might say, well, what's the difference here between handing out and distributing client certificates and JWT tokens? And the main difference is that the keys are longer and the cryptography is harder. But in terms of administrative overhead, there's not a big win for you, right? So what we are doing is we are saying instead of us having to be the certificate agency, we will accept certificates that we already know are valid. And these are certificates that are coming from the certificate agencies that are creating the certificates that you use to present, or that your CDN is presenting to their visitors. So for instance, if I'm running example.com and I'm getting a certificate from Let's Encrypt, then this is the certificate that I would present to my visitors who are going to https www example.com. And with mutual TLS, assuming that example.com is using Edge delivery services as a backend and is authenticated, what I would do is I would set up my CDN for example.com to not just present the same certificate to visitors, but also to the origin, right? So it would present the same certificate issued by Let's Encrypt to to the aem.live origin. aem.live would say, oh, you're presenting a certificate. This is really nice of you. Let me validate if this is actually issued by a certificate agency that we trust, right? And we're going to trust Let's Encrypt, DigiCert, Zero SSL, and a couple of others. And if we trust it, then we do the next thing, which is we check if the site that we are trying to access, if this is actually requiring authentication, right? So we are going to go to something like main dash dash example website dash dash example dot aem.live. And for this site, we have in the configuration that example.com is actually the production host name, and that authentication is required. And now we know a valid certificate has been presented. This certificate is valid for the domain that is set up in the production host name, and the certificate has been enabled for the host that is the production that is in the config bus for the production host name, and we can start and deliver content. If any of these would not be the case, right? So if either the certificate is not valid, or it's coming from a certificate agency that we don't trust, or if the host names don't match, that's when we would simply serve a 401 and would say, you know what, nice try, but this content is not for you. And the nice thing about this is that as you are rotating your normal client-facing SSL certificates anyway, right? If you're using Let's Encrypt, or if you're using any of the more modern certificate agencies, you're doing this at least every 3 months. And if not, you're doing it at least on a yearly basis. You can also rotate the certificate that you're presenting to us. And that leads to not just a much more secure connection, but also to a much more robust and essentially maintenance-free operation of your site. So that's the last part. Based on the length of my explanation, you can guess roughly how esoteric that feature is. But that basically concludes the architectural introduction to aem.live. To aem.live, aem.page, which internally we call Helix 5, the Helix 5 architecture. There's one additional point to this, which is I mentioned the config service. The config service obviously also has its equivalent in the admin service. So for the admin service, there will be additional API calls to read configuration and to update configuration. So I think before we go into questions, I want to anticipate one more question, which is, when is this going to be available? And the answer to this is you are going to be is the wrong tense, because it is already available. We have a couple of sites already running on Helix 5 aem-live, and Toby, and when I say a couple sites, I would probably have to say a couple dozen sites, right? We're still in the double digits, so not yet triple digits, but it's a good chunk of sites. And
yes, so hi. Just maybe to mention that because you mentioned the config service. So the config service is kind of the unified view now for the configuration that used to live in .helix/config spreadsheet, and in other places like the FS tab and like the query YAML and all these things, right?
headers, XSLX.
Headers and so forth, yes. And so, and there are two parts of it. One is, of course, the thing that aggregates and presents the config to the services that need it. But this is all kind of internal. So the customer, or you as a customer, and also the client, the client JavaScript will not have access to the config per se. But there's one piece of the config which we call public config, which can be accessed from the client using just /config JSON probably. Yeah, I think this already works.
Yep.
But yes, and then of course there is the management part of it where you can read and write the config that is stored. Like it has a defined JSON schema and a REST API, and you do that using the admin service. And but the cool thing is now that we have this config service, we can kind of use this, call it legacy mode, where we kind of aggregate the Helix 4 configuration pieces together and kind of present the config as it that Helix 5 needs. So all Helix 5 sites are automatically kind of work already in the Helix 5.
All Helix 4 sites already work on Helix 5.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Yes. In theory.
And in practice, we want to know you when you are switching, so that we can be there for you. Which means we are maintaining an allow list of sites and GitHub orgs that are enabled for Helix 5. And if you want your site to be enabled, just let us know, and we can do that right now. And Ina, I think you're looking as if you want to try a site right here. So if you have a site that you want to try, we can enable it, right? And you, in order to make it production ready, you would have to do the CDN change anyway. But
there's one caveat to add to that, that if your site has authentication enabled, it will not work on Helix. Well, it will work on Helix 5, but you will not be able to access it unless you set kind of the new tokens.
Right.
But you cannot set the new tokens until we migrate the config to Helix 5. So there's kind of a one-way ticket for authenticated sites.
Yeah.
But if not, then we can just try it out.
Right.
And also, if you want to use other features like the having the same repository for multiple content sources. So this also, of course, requires a new Helix 5 configuration setup, which is also a bit more.
Yeah.
It's not self-service right now, but so this is also more complicated. But if you just want to try out your site on Helix 5, that's relatively easy fixed by just updating the allow list.
But you're saying that now we can have a way to enable authentication, just that it's not as self-service as we'd like? I mean, we need to go through you?
Yes, it's the same procedure. You have to go through me. But and also it's not so your authors or your surfers, they won't be able to access it. So we removed the Microsoft login for the authenticated sites, not for Sidekick, that's still there, but for the site itself. So if you have authentication, all you can have is a token, and then you have to either use mod header or something to pass the token along if you want to develop it, if you want to play around with it, or you have to set up your own CDN for the preview and the live hosts that injects the token. And of course, you have to configure the production CDN with the token. So a mechanism that the author can access the page will be added to the Sidekick, or maybe it's already there, but I'm not sure. I have to check.
Okay. Are there more questions?
One question I said about the performance. What are the numbers saying? Are there enough sample data or RAM data already to compare it?
It's roughly the same.
Helix 5 and Helix 5.
It's roughly the same, except right. I mentioned we are going to have caching for aem.page, which is a quality of life improvement for your authors, but not making a big difference, not making any difference at all for your visitors. Right, so
when do you expect general availability of Helix 5 rather than by invite?
I don't know. It's we first of all, we don't like to make these kinds of statements. Second, we are rolling this out progressively, right? And as I said, already in the high double digits of repositories. I expect us to get annoyed by the fact that we have to needlessly allow list sites when nothing really is happening anyway, pretty soon. But the important thing is anyone who wants to try it right now can try it, simply by contacting us, and we will enable it and help you get migrated.
Thank you.
So
Definitely sounds nice to get migrated soon. So caching enabled on aem.page also means that Lighthouse score is more realistic to the live side, or?
yes, if you're testing, right, so if the CodeSync bot is testing against aem.page,
Yeah,
that's right.
yeah.
Okay. It seems we're getting no takers for. Go ahead.
I've got a couple of questions if you don't mind.
Yep.
So I think firstly on the client certificate authentication.
Yes.
You mentioned using your existing certificate that you're serving the public content.
Yeah.
As part of the validation that we do, does that certificate need to be issued for client authentication as well as server authentication?
It's the same certificate. So there's no. So when you get a certificate, and we've been testing this with Let's Encrypt and DigiCert and Zero SSL, and basically they give you a certificate and they don't tell you which way to use it, right? So, and that's the and I would say using Let's Encrypt certificates and as client certificates is slightly unusual. It's a slightly unusual approach, right? So that is why you won't find a lot of documentation, and why we expect to do a bit of hand-holding while this is happening. But it's the same certificate that you would get otherwise. Same PEM file.
Okay.
Yeah.
Cool. And on the config bus, or the concept of repo list, I guess, is more maybe the question. We have a lot of customers that traditionally probably built like a set of common components that they used across multiple sites,
right.
But maybe even still they had specific components on each given site.
Mm-hmm.
So like the concept of like block reuse or something like that.
Right.
Is that something that's achievable? I mean, I know you mentioned kind of like you could serve the full code from another repo, but is there a concept of combining or anything like that planned or thought about?
Toby, I'm looking at you because
I think
thinking,
initially there was the idea.
yes, because we initially had this, initially had this idea, and it's one thing that you might know is that that Milo, which is the framework that is running most of the Adobe.com properties, has implemented this particular concept. So the blanking between Toby and me that you just got that you just saw was, did we forget about this? Did we not implement this for a good reason? So the thing is, when we started with Helix 5, we were thinking of including this, and we didn't. But there are ways to implement this on top of on top of your stack.
Yeah, so one thing you can do, I mean, it depends on if the same, so let's say you have the same block library and but you want to have variations in the blocks, right? So you can do that with style sheets. But of course, this is part of the same code right now, right? So there's a way. The only way we can do now, we can have this public configuration, as I said, that would be access to /config JSON, and you could read that to then kind of decide client side what blocks you want to enable or disable or change some design properties. I think there are some ideas also around to, especially for style sheets, that you could kind of influence that you would have a dynamically generated style sheet somehow, or at least have some kind of template language or some easy pattern where you can kind of replace values within the style sheet. But I think that's the most we will do at the moment. So yeah, but right now the only thing that already works is having like this public config, so you can have multiple sites. Every site has the same content repository, has different SharePoint or GitHub pointers. Google pointers, Google Drive pointers.
Yeah.
So the same repository, different content, and also different configuration, site configuration, so to speak, right? So for example, this says red and this says green, and client side, you do whatever you want to do with that.
Yeah. Okay. So, yeah. And as always, the more, right? So the thing is, as Milo has shown, this can be done on the project level already, and the more projects we see that do this, the more likely it is that we are going to adopt this into the core. But I would say it narrowly didn't make the cut, and yeah.
Good, thank you.
Okay. Do we have more questions? Because if not, then I have a question for Dominic, and Dominic already knows where this is going. When are we going to talk next, and what are we going to talk about?
Yeah, I mean there will be a second session because we want to cover with Helix Live. We want to hit it live. Oh, now I see
5.
already Helix Live. It's also a good name, huh?
Yep.
Helix 5. We will cover, of course, all time zones. So we will do next Thursday, also not this Thursday, the week after, on the 6th of June at 5 p.m. CET. Will be the next session,
Excellent.
Helix 5. So I hope. You can join again, of course, if you have more questions until then, or we try to get more people on board after next.
Let's make sure that we send an invite to Toby this time.
And maybe Dominic will just do it.
Yeah, and
We'll do so.
And I know we have a couple of regulars on this call who are also probably going to join the Thursday call. So if you want to bring a site by next week, I'd be delighted to try this out live. You know, I like to live dangerously, especially if it's your sites. No, and the thing is, I'm just kidding, right? This is the migration is pain free, is completely forward compatible, and I'm not going to peer pressure you into changing your CDN configuration live on the call. So think about this. Other than that,
I will check with the team.
Great.
So it could be that you have one.
Yep. Other than that, I want to thank everyone for joining the call today, for asking questions, and I'm as I mentioned, excited to hear from you. Get your owner repo combinations so that we can get Helix 5 into your hands, get your feedback, and accelerate the overall rollout that we're doing with this. So thanks everyone.